What happens after we die? In 2022, physicians in Estonia were observing an 7-year-old patient who suffered from seizures. He was connected to an electroencephalogram, a device designed to monitor brain activity and record brainwaves in real time. Their research was never intended to focus on death itself. Their attention was on epilepsy. But during the examination, his heart suddenly stopped beating because the equipment continued operating. The doctors accidentally documented something no one had ever captured before: the final 30 seconds of activity inside a human brain. What appeared on the recording was not emptiness. It was not a gentle descent into blackness. The brain exploded into activity. Gamma waves, the quickest, flooded across his cortex in the seconds before and after cardiac arrest. The brain did not simply power down. It blazed with activity. And according to the scientists who later published the study in Frontiers in Aging Neuroscience, the patterns suggested that the brain might have been revisiting memories from an entire lifetime. Tonight, we are going to pursue that mystery wherever it may lead. We are going to examine the science behind the dying brain and explore what happens in those final instants when oxygen disappears and consciousness begins to tremble at the edge. We are also going to hear the testimonies of people who returned after cardiac arrest, survivors who described events they claimed to witness while they were clinically dead, details that were later confirmed by the medical professionals standing inside the room. We are about to examine a substance known as dimethyltryptamine, one of the strongest psychedelic compounds ever identified by modern science, and the increasing evidence suggesting that the human brain may naturally produce it in the final moments before death. We are going to stand beside hospital rooms where patients suffering from severe Alzheimer's disease, people who had remained silent for years, unexpectedly awakened, recognized loved ones, spoke clearly with their families, and then peacefully died the following morning. We are going to journey through the Egyptian underworld, guided by the Book of the Dead. We are going to pass through the bardos described in Tibetan Buddhism. We are going to dine in Valhalla beside the Norse and travel across the river Styx with the Greeks. We are going to ask what the 4 billion believers within the Abrahamic religions think occurs the instant the heart ceases beating. And we are going to trace a path through quantum physics that led a Nobel Prize-winning mathematician to propose that consciousness may not actually exist inside the brain at all. Chapter 1. The final 30 seconds. Most people imagine death in a very simple way. The heart stops, the brain powers down, everything fades to black. That is what films usually portray. That is how many of us picture it. A switch. On, then off. But scientific evidence paints a far more complicated picture. And the story begins with a man whose identity the world will never know. He was 87 years old. He had been receiving treatment at Tartu University Hospital for epilepsy that developed after a traumatic injury to his brain. Doctors attached an electroencephalogram to his head in order to monitor seizure activity. It was an ordinary procedure. Nothing unusual. Then suddenly, without any warning, his heart stopped. The medical staff did not expect it. But the machine continued running. The EEG kept collecting data, and during that accidental moment, science witnessed for the very first time what a human brain does while dying. Ajmal Zemar, a neurosurgeon from the University of Louisville, was among the researchers who studied the recordings. Their findings were published in 2022 by Frontiers in Aging Neuroscience. During the 30 seconds before and after the heart stopped, the brain displayed an intense surge of gamma wave activity. Gamma waves are the fastest brain frequencies scientists can currently measure. They are connected with conscious awareness, active cognition, and the storing and recovery of memories. These are the same waves that appear when a person becomes deeply focused, enters profound meditation, or experiences vivid dreams. Zemmer explained the discovery cautiously. He suggested that the brain may be replaying important memories from life immediately before death occurs. The same neurological patterns involved when you remember childhood experiences, dream about someone you care about, or focus intensely on something meaningful suddenly erupted inside this dying man's brain. Not in chaotic bursts, but in structured and coordinated waves, almost as though the brain was intentionally carrying out one final process. But this evidence came from only one individual, one recording, one unexpected observation. Researchers needed additional proof, and in 2023, more evidence appeared. Jimo Borjigin, a neuroscientist at the University of Michigan, had been investigating this mystery since 2013, when her laboratory identified bursts of gamma activity in dying rats. She later shifted her research toward human patients. Her team monitored 4 people experiencing cardiac arrest while connected to continuous EEG recording systems. These patients were comatose and had no possibility of recovery. Their families had consented to removing life support. EEG caps were attached before the ventilators were switched off. 2 of the 4 patients displayed enormous surges of gamma wave activity immediately after ventilation ended. The activity centered in a particular region of the brain called the temporoparietal occipital junction. This region is positioned near the back of the brain, behind the ear, where the temporal, parietal, and occipital lobes meet together. It is considered one of the most significant areas involved in the neuroscience of consciousness. This is where the brain combines sensory information into a unified experience. It is also the same region that becomes active during out-of-body experiences and vivid dreaming. And in these dying patients, it ignited intensely. The gamma wave connections did not remain isolated in one area. They spread between both hemispheres of the brain, linking the rear regions with the prefrontal cortex at the front, the area associated with advanced thought, decision-making, and self-awareness. The dying brain was not merely discharging random electrical activity, it was communicating internally. Brain regions responsible for perception were interacting with regions responsible for meaning and awareness. George Masur, founding director of the Michigan Center for Consciousness Science and co-author of the study, described the phenomenon as a neuroscientific paradox. How can such intense and vivid experiences arise from a brain that is in the process of shutting down? For decades, the dominant scientific belief was that the brain simply ceased functioning at the moment death began. But the data collected by Jimo Borjigin suggested the exact opposite. And here is the part that makes the discovery deeply disturbing. The bursts of gamma activity continued even after the heart had already stopped beating. Blood was no longer being pumped through the body. Oxygen was no longer reaching the brain. Yet the brain became even more electrically active than it had been in the final minutes before death. It was almost as though the absence of oxygen itself triggered the response, as if the brain, recognizing that the end had arrived, answered not with darkness or silence, but with one final explosion of synchronized activity. Researchers are now beginning to describe a 3-stage model of the dying process. Dr. Charlotte Marchal at the University of Liège has explained the neurological progression of death as a sequence of events. First comes the surge, an intense spike of brain activity as the brain reacts to oxygen deprivation. This may represent a primitive survival mechanism, a last desperate attempt to remain alive. Second comes a slow wave phase, where lower frequency brainwave activity begins to dominate. And finally comes the flatline, the point at which EEG recordings appear silent, but the flatline displayed on a cardiac monitor, the one commonly shown in hospital television dramas, is not necessarily the same thing as brain death. Actual brain death may happen several minutes afterward, perhaps even longer. Dr. Sam Pania, one of the world's leading researchers studying death and resuscitation at NYU Langone Health, has argued that dying may remain reversible for much longer than medicine once believed. His research indicates that significant brain activity may continue for as long as an hour after the heart stops, and possibly beyond that. Think carefully about the implications of this. At the exact moment we declare a person dead, their brain may still be functioning, still interpreting information, still in some way having an experience. We cannot ask this 7-year-old patient what he witnessed. We cannot ask those 4 patients in Michigan what they felt or perceived. They are no longer here. The recordings are all that remain, but those recordings are astonishing. They reveal that the dying brain does not simply fade away peacefully. It struggles. It surges with energy. It activates the same regions connected to consciousness, memory, and the sensation of being alive. And it does all of this precisely at the moment when, according to everything we once believed about neuroscience, it should have been completely inactive. If the brain becomes this active during death, then what exactly is it experiencing? Is it replaying the memories of an entire lifetime? Is it producing one final dream before consciousness disappears? Or is it somehow opening a doorway that those of us still living are unable to perceive? Some individuals have returned after crossing that threshold, and the accounts they give are strikingly similar, across different cultures, across different continents, across different centuries. That is where our story moves next. Chapter 2. The People Who Returned. In 2014, a study appeared in the journal Resuscitation that became the largest scientific investigation of death ever attempted. The project was called the AWARE Study, short for Awareness During Resuscitation. It was directed by Dr. Sam Parnia, who at that time was working at Stony Brook University. The research extended across 15 hospitals located throughout the United Kingdom, the United States, and Austria. Over the course of 4 years, the team followed 2,060 patients who experienced cardiac arrest. Their hearts stopped beating. Clinically, they were dead, yet some of them later returned to life. Among the survivors who were able to participate in interviews, 39% reported some form of awareness during the period in which they were clinically dead. These were not vague impressions or disconnected fragments of confusion. They were structured, coherent experiences that many participants described as feeling even more real than ordinary waking consciousness. One particular patient drew intense attention from the research team. He was a 7-year-old man who suffered cardiac arrest inside a hospital in the United Kingdom. His heart stopped for 3 minutes. During that period, there was no heartbeat. No blood circulated through his body. According to conventional neuroscience, brain function should have stopped within 20 to 30 seconds after cardiac arrest. Yet once he was successfully resuscitated, he described events that had taken place inside the room during those same 3 minutes. He described the actions performed by the medical staff. He recalled the sounds produced by the machines around him. He even mentioned highly specific details that were later confirmed by the doctors and nurses who had been treating him. This creates a profound paradox. The brain is generally believed to stop functioning within 20 to 30 seconds after the heart ceases beating, yet this patient accurately described events occurring during a 3-minute span of clinical death. Either the brain was somehow still processing information despite the absence of blood circulation, or something else entirely was happening. The AWARE researchers did not claim to know the answer. They only presented the evidence they had collected. Then came AWARE 2. Published in 2023 Inches, the same journal, the follow-up investigation expanded the scope even further. The study involved 25 hospitals and 567 cardiac arrest patients, and for the first time, 85 of those individuals were monitored continuously with EEG recordings during cardiopulmonary resuscitation. The scientists were not merely speaking with survivors afterward and collecting stories once everything was over. They were monitoring brain activity live while medical teams struggled to restart the heart and restore life. Among the 53 patients who survived long enough to leave the hospital, 28 later participated in interviews. Out of those, 11 individuals, close to 40%, described memories or perceptions that suggested some form of awareness during cardiac arrest. 6 of them recounted detailed and highly structured experiences that occurred while they were considered clinically dead. These reports did not resemble random hallucinations or the chaotic confusion expected from a failing brain. They were coherent, ordered, and emotionally significant experiences. The EEG recordings introduced evidence that earlier studies had never managed to obtain: brain activity involving delta, theta, and alpha waves, electrical patterns connected to different states of consciousness, continued appearing for as long as 60 minutes after death had been clinically declared. The brain seemed to display signs of organized electrical restoration deep into the CPR effort. Sam Parnia spoke openly about what this might mean. He explained that these lucid experiences should not simply be dismissed as tricks produced by a dying or disorganized brain, but instead may represent a distinct human experience arising at the edge of death. His research team proposed that the dying brain enters a condition known as disinhibition. Under ordinary conditions, the brain contains natural braking mechanisms, inhibitory systems designed to regulate and limit conscious awareness. When death begins approaching, those systems start to collapse, the filters weaken, and, according to Parnia, what surfaces may include access to deeply stored memories, reaching from early childhood all the way to the final moments of life, viewed not only as personal recollections, but through a moral perspective as well. That final point deserves careful attention. Numerous survivors across both AWARE studies reported not only remembering their lives, but reliving them completely, and not solely through their own eyes. Many described feeling the emotional consequences of their actions on other people, sensing the pain or joy they caused others, and witnessing their lives from the perspective of everyone they had touched. This remains one of the most frequently reported characteristics of near-death experiences across nearly all available research, not only within the AWARE investigations. Researchers refer to it as the panoramic life review, and similar descriptions appear in testimonies collected all around the world. Near-death experiences have been examined for decades, long before Parnia began his work. Across thousands of testimonies from cardiac arrest survivors, drowning victims, and people who came within seconds of death because of illness or severe injury, an astonishingly consistent pattern continues to appear: separation from the body. Survivors often describe floating above themselves and watching their own body, while doctors and nurses worked frantically below. Many report a strange calmness and emotional detachment, observing everything without fear or pain. A tunnel or corridor of light. Many individuals describe traveling through darkness toward an immense brightness. The light is rarely described as harsh or blinding. Instead, it is portrayed as comforting, warm, welcoming, and filled with overwhelming love, encounters with others. Survivors frequently speak about meeting deceased family members, friends, or beings they interpret as spiritual presences. These encounters are usually described as extraordinarily real rather than dreamlike. The Life Review. A complete panoramic replay of a person's existence, experienced not one moment at a time, but all at once, carrying immense emotional intensity. Many individuals describe directly feeling the effects their compassion or cruelty had on other people. A boundary, a border, a river, a gate, or a dividing line beyond which there is no return. Survivors often describe arriving at this threshold and either being told or somehow understanding that they must return because their time has not yet come. And finally, an overwhelming sense of peace. Almost universally, people who survive these experiences describe a level of love, acceptance, and serenity so profound that many resisted coming back to their physical bodies. Many insist it felt more real than ordinary life itself. The skeptical interpretation is relatively simple. The brain is shutting down. Oxygen deprivation is spreading. Neurochemicals are flooding the nervous system. In the middle of this final biological crisis, the brain creates a hallucination. A vivid and comforting hallucination, shaped by evolution to soften the process of dying. The tunnel of light could simply result from the visual cortex malfunctioning as blood circulation collapses. The sensation of peace may come from a massive release of endorphins. The life review may be nothing more than scattered memory activation. Encounters with deceased loved ones may reflect emotional wish fulfillment. This explanation is reasonable. Some aspects of it are almost certainly true. A dying brain is undeniably a neurochemical storm, and at least part of the near-death experience is likely produced by that storm. But the skeptical explanation carries a serious problem. It struggles to fully explain the verified perceptions. The 5-7-year-old patient in AWARE who correctly recounted nearly 3 minutes of events that happened during cardiac arrest. The individuals across different studies who recalled precise information. The placement of medical equipment. The exact phrases spoken by doctors and nurses. The procedures carried out during resuscitation. Information that was later verified by the staff members present in the room. If these experiences were nothing more than internal hallucinations created by a dying brain, then how was the brain able to obtain accurate knowledge about external events taking place while brain activity appeared flatlined? Is less than #0. For is greater than. Parnia's research team remained extremely careful in their conclusions. They stated that current research has neither confirmed nor denied the reality or meaning of patients' experiences and claims of awareness connected to death. They never argued that near-death experiences prove an afterlife exists. They never claimed consciousness unquestionably survives physical death. What they did say was much simpler. The data is genuine, the experiences themselves are genuine, and the standard explanations still fail to completely explain everything being witnessed. Yet there may be one substance capable of connecting neuroscience with the extraordinary visions many dying people report. A compound so intense that a single exposure can completely erase your normal sense of identity. A compound capable of producing experiences remarkably similar to those described by near-death survivors. A compound that, according to a groundbreaking 2019 study, the human brain may already create naturally. Its name is dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, and it could represent an important clue to understanding what occurs during the final moments of life. Chapter 3. The Spirit Molecule. In 1990, a clinical psychiatrist named Rick Strassman at University of New Mexico received something no scientist in the United States had obtained in more than 20 years: federal authorization to administer a powerful psychedelic substance to human volunteers. The substance was dimethyltryptamine, DMT, and what participants described during the following 5 years would dramatically transform discussions surrounding consciousness, death, and the lines separating science from spirituality. DMT was not a modern discovery. Indigenous cultures throughout the Amazon basin had used it for centuries through ayahuasca, a ceremonial brew created from plants containing DMT mixed with a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, allowing the compound to survive digestion and enter the brain. In its purified form, when delivered intravenously, DMT acts almost immediately. The effects generally continue for around 15 to 20 minutes. Yet within those brief minutes, volunteers in Strassman's experiments reported experiences that sounded far less like ordinary drug intoxication and far more like travel into another reality entirely. They described the total collapse of their individual identity. They described racing through tunnels filled with light at impossible velocity. They described meeting beings, entities, and presences that felt even more real than ordinary waking life. They described immense sensations of love, understanding, and union with something enormous and beyond comprehension. Some participants said they were shown scenes from their entire lives. Others reported being told that death was not the end. Some spoke about landscapes of indescribable beauty. And when the experience ended, many cried. Not because they were frightened, but because they felt sorrow at returning. Strassman released his findings in 2000 Inches, a book titled DMT, The Spirit Molecule. Inside the book, he introduced a bold hypothesis. He proposed that the pineal gland, a tiny structure located deep within the center of the brain, the same organ philosopher René Descartes once referred to as the seat of the soul, could produce and release DMT during 3 major moments of existence: at birth, during dreams, and at the instant of death. He suggested DMT was not merely a recreational chemical. It was a biological system connected to spiritual experience, a chemical bridge linking the physical brain to whatever may exist beyond ordinary perception. The theory captured the attention of millions of people. It also faced severe criticism from scientists. The pineal gland is extremely small, approximately the size of a grain of rice and weighing less than 0.2 of a gram. Its primary confirmed role involves producing melatonin, the the hormone responsible for regulating sleep cycles. The claim that such a tiny structure could manufacture enough DMT to trigger a complete psychedelic experience remained deeply controversial. Then, at the age of 19, a study altered the discussion entirely. A research team led by John Dean at the University of Michigan, working under Dr. Jimo Borjigan, the same neuroscientist who would later publish the dying brain gamma wave research, carried out a landmark investigation. Their findings appeared in Scientific Reports, a journal within the Nature portfolio, and the results were extraordinary. First, the researchers discovered that the gene responsible for indolethylamine N-methyltransferase, known as INMT, the essential enzyme needed for DMT synthesis, is expressed not only in the pineal gland, but throughout several different areas of the brain. Researchers discovered it inside the cerebral cortex of both humans and rats. They also identified it within the choroid plexus, the structure responsible for creating cerebrospinal fluid, and most importantly, they discovered that INMT was being co-expressed alongside another enzyme known as aromatic L-amino acid decarboxylase, or AADC, within the exact same brain cells. Both of these enzymes are essential for the production of DMT, and they were located together inside neurons of the mammalian neocortex. Next, the scientists measured the real concentration of DMT in the brains of living rats through microdialysis, a method capable of sampling the fluid surrounding neurons in real time. The concentrations they detected were comparable to serotonin and dopamine, two of the brain's most significant neurotransmitters. DMT was not some insignificant chemical left over. It existed at concentrations meaningful enough to affect neurological function. Third, and this became the most important discovery for our story, the researchers induced cardiac arrest in the rats. When that happened, DMT levels inside the visual cortex rose dramatically. As the brain moved toward death, it began generating greater amounts of DMT. And here was the detail that completely disrupted the original pineal gland hypothesis. Some of those rats had already undergone surgical removal of their pineal glands, yet the DMT surge still happened. The brain itself, not merely the pineal gland, was actively producing and releasing DMT during cardiac arrest. This marked a major turning point. For many years, the proposed connection between DMT and death had remained largely theoretical. Rick Strassman had introduced an elegant hypothesis, but it lacked direct proof. Now there was measurable evidence. DMT is endogenous, meaning the brain naturally creates it on its own. It exists at neurologically meaningful levels, and those levels increase during the dying process. In 2018, 1 year before Dean's study appeared, another important experiment was conducted by a research team led by Christopher Timmerman at Imperial College London. They administered intravenous DMT to healthy volunteers and afterward asked them to complete a standardized near-death experience questionnaire, the same evaluation scale used for people who survived cardiac arrest. Their findings were later published in Frontiers in Psychology. The similarities were astonishing. Participants who received DMT described experiences that matched the near-death experience scale with remarkable precision. Ego dissolution, tunnels filled with light, encounters with entities, a feeling of transcendence, deep sensations of peace and love. The panoramic life review, the sensation of passing beyond a threshold. Point after point, the DMT experience and the near-death experience shared nearly identical structures. Still, the scientific community remains careful, and for valid reasons. In 2018, pharmacologist David Nichols published an important criticism of the theory. He emphasized that the pineal gland weighs less than 0.2 of a gram and generates only around 30 micrograms of melatonin daily. To create a psychoactive amount of DMT, the brain would need to rapidly produce approximately 25 milligrams. That amount is nearly 1,000 times larger than the pineal gland's ordinary daily melatonin production. In addition, DMT is broken down extremely quickly by an enzyme called monoamine oxidase. Even if the brain generated a powerful DMT surge during death, the compound would likely be metabolized almost immediately. Whether enough DMT could gather in the correct regions of the brain at precisely the right moment to produce a complete psychedelic experience is still genuinely uncertain. As often happens in science, the truth likely rests somewhere between the extremes. DMT is endogenous. The brain naturally produces it. That has been confirmed. DMT concentrations increase during cardiac arrest. That has also been confirmed. Experiences triggered by external DMT administration closely mirror near-death experiences in structure and pattern. That, too, has been confirmed. But whether the brain can create enough DMT at the instant of death to fully generate everything near-death survivors describe remains an unresolved question. And there is another important dimension to this discussion. In 2024, a review published in Frontiers in Pharmacology concluded that DMT interacts with sigma, one receptors connected to neuroprotection, neuroplasticity, and cellular survival. DMT may not simply be a molecule capable of producing visions. It may also function as a substance that helps defend the brain during periods of extreme stress, a final chemical emergency response. The brain's own rescue mechanism, saturating the cortex with a compound that both protects neurons from damage and simultaneously pushes perception to its absolute limits. If that interpretation is correct, then the dying brain is not merely hallucinating. It is not simply malfunctioning. It may actually be carrying out the exact process it evolved to perform, releasing a compound that shields itself while at the same time generating an experience so vivid, so organized, and so radically different from ordinary awareness that the people who undergo it often return permanently transformed. Whether that experience represents a glimpse into something objectively real or simply a beautiful chemical farewell is something science still cannot determine. But the chemistry of the brain itself appears to be pointing towards something important. It is showing us that death is not simply something passive that happens to the body. It is a dynamic event, something the brain appears to have been preparing itself for throughout life. But before we move further into the questions surrounding consciousness and whatever may continue beyond physical existence, we first have to confront something many people would rather avoid entirely. Something that collides with every hopeful vision of transcendence through the harsh and undeniable reality of biology. A phenomenon so unusual and so poorly understood that it has unsettled neuroscientists who believed they already understood the mechanics of the human brain. Individuals with Alzheimer's disease, people who have not spoken for years, who no longer recognize their own children, suddenly awakening and becoming themselves again. Aware, focused, fully present, and then dying shortly afterward. This phenomenon is known as terminal lucidity, and according to everything neuroscience currently teaches, it should not be possible. Chapter 4. The Impossible Awakening. A woman in her 90s had spent 9 years living with Alzheimer's disease. For years, she no longer recognized her son. She could not explain where she was. She did not know her own age. She was unable to complete a full sentence. Then, just 24 hours before her death, something changed. She woke up. She recognized her relatives immediately. She remembered their names. She knew how old she was. She identified the care facility where she had been living. She carried on a real conversation. She became mentally present again in a way nobody had witnessed in nearly a decade. And by the following morning, she had died. This is not folklore. This is a medically documented case recorded in scientific literature, and it is far from an isolated event. It is only one among hundreds, perhaps even thousands, of similar reports shared by families and healthcare professionals across the world. The condition is called terminal lucidity, and it stands as one of the most puzzling mysteries in modern neuroscience. Terminal lucidity describes the sudden and unexpected reappearance of mental clarity in patients suffering from severe and irreversible brain disorders, most commonly during the final hours or days before death. Patients with advanced Alzheimer's disease, who have been unable to speak for months or even years, suddenly begin talking again. They identify relatives they have not reacted to in years. They retrieve memories that should have disappeared together with the damaged neural pathways that once preserved them. They show affection, they say farewell, and then they die. The phrase terminal lucidity was introduced in 2009 by biologist Michael Nahm and psychiatrist Bruce Greyson. Since that time, an expanding body of research has demonstrated that the phenomenon may not be uncommon at all. A 2021 study conducted by Alexander Bathiani and Bruce Greyson discovered that only 6% of paradoxical lucidity patients survived for more than one additional week. The phenomenon appears strongly tied to the process of dying itself. It is almost as though the brain, during its final stage, carries out one final restoration before shutting down completely. Surveys involving medical professionals reveal an extraordinary pattern. In one investigation, 73% of palliative care workers stated that they had personally witnessed at least one case of terminal lucidity during their careers. In a 2025 prospective study directed by Sam Parnia and his team at NYU Langone Health, researchers monitored more than 1,500 individuals with moderate to severe dementia. Among the 151 patients who were officially enrolled, 61.6% experienced at least one lucid episode. The researchers recorded 267 separate lucid events. These episodes included awareness of surroundings, the recovery of old memories, the return of abilities such as walking or playing musical instruments, and meaningful nonverbal interaction. A 2024 study published in The Gerontologist by Jason Karlowish and colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania carried out detailed interviews with 30 caregivers of people living with severe dementia. Out of those 30 caregivers, 25 described a combined total of 34 lucid episodes. Many of these moments were extremely short, sometimes lasting only a few seconds. One word, one movement. One facial expression that suddenly gave loved ones the unmistakable feeling that the person they thought was gone was somehow still there inside. One caregiver described a man suffering from severe dementia who had remained completely silent for months. On the evening before his death, he requested a cigarette and a beer. He sang songs together with friends and family members. He laughed and talked with them for almost 45 minutes. Afterward, he went to sleep. By the next morning, he was dead. This is why the phenomenon matters so deeply, and why it unsettles neuroscientists so profoundly. The dominant understanding of consciousness in neuroscience is relatively simple. Your memories, your identity, your personality, your sense of self, all of it is believed to exist within the physical structure of the brain. These functions are encoded through neural networks, through synapses, connecting roughly 86 billion neurons with an estimated 100 trillion synaptic connections. When those networks are destroyed, the functions they support should disappear as well, permanently and irreversibly. Alzheimer's disease, the most widespread cause of dementia, systematically destroys the brain itself. Amyloid beta plaques and tau protein tangles accumulate between and inside neurons, disrupting communication, triggering inflammation, and ultimately killing brain cells. In advanced Alzheimer, the hippocampus, the brain's memory center, is devastated. The cortex, where higher-order thinking occurs, is riddled with damage. Brain scans of patients with end-stage Alzheimer show massive tissue loss. The brain has physically shrunk. The structures that store decades of memories are not just damaged. In many cases, they are gone. And yet, terminal lucidity happens. People with brains that have been ravaged by decades of neurodegenerative disease suddenly function as if the damage does not exist. They access memories that should have been destroyed. They demonstrate cognitive abilities that should have been permanently lost. And then they die. How? No one knows. But there are hypotheses. One proposal suggests the spontaneous formation of neural bypasses. Even in severely damaged brains, there may be dormant circuits, silent synapses, that can temporarily route around the destroyed pathways and restore connectivity at a network level. Recent research has revealed that the adult cortex contains far more silent synapses than previously believed by an order of magnitude. These unused connections might, under the right conditions, light up like detour routes on a broken highway. Another hypothesis connects terminal lucidity to the same brain processes we discussed in Chapter 1. If the dying brain undergoes disinhibition, removing its natural braking systems, it is possible that this same mechanism could temporarily restore access to memories and cognitive functions that had been suppressed but not fully destroyed by Alzheimer pathology. The disease may lock the door, the dying process may briefly blow it open. A 2024 perspective published in Molecular Neurodegeneration pointed to an intriguing possibility. Using a specialized brain imaging technique called cyclic azopeptide oligomer positron emission tomography, researchers discovered that the toxic amyloid beta oligomers in Alzheimer's disease do not accumulate steadily. They fluctuate. Sometimes they clear specific brain regions temporarily, creating windows where those regions might function more normally. At certain moments, the parietal cortex might be relatively clear, while other regions are clouded. Then the pattern shifts. This fluctuation could explain brief, spontaneous episodes of clarity. And here is where the story circles back to DMT. The same 2024 perspective noted that microdosing dimethyltryptamine has been shown in animal models to promote neuroplasticity and potentially reopen the brain's critical learning windows. Through its interaction with sigma-1 receptors and intracellular serotonin 2A receptors, DMT may have the ability to stimulate the formation of new neural connections, even in damaged tissue. If the dying brain releases a surge of endogenous DMT, as the 2019 Dean study showed in rats, could that surge temporarily restore connectivity in a brain devastated by Alzheimer? It is speculative. It is unproven, but the pieces fit together in a way that demands attention. The dying brain surges with gamma activity, the dying brain releases DMT, and the dying brain sometimes restores cognitive function in people who should have none left. The National Institutes of Health have taken notice. Sam Panier at NYU Langone Health has received a 5-year grant funded by the National Institute on Aging to conduct the first prospective study of paradoxical lucidity in approximately 500 terminally ill dementia patients. Each patient will be connected to in-home video EEG devices to capture brain activity before, during, and after any lucid episodes. The goal is to determine whether lucidity episodes correlate with specific electrocortical biomarkers, measurable brain signatures, that could not only explain terminal lucidity, but potentially be used as therapeutic targets for dementia treatment. Think about what that means. If terminal lucidity can be understood mechanistically, if we can identify what the brain does to temporarily restore itself, we might be able to trigger that process deliberately. We might be able to give people with severe dementia back their minds, even briefly. We might be able to let them say goodbye. But there is a deeper question here, one that goes beyond medicine. If a brain ravaged by decades of disease can suddenly function perfectly minutes before death, what does that tell us about where consciousness actually resides? Is it entirely in the neurons? Is it a product of the physical structure of the brain? Or is the brain something more like a receiver, a device that tunes into consciousness the way a radio tunes into a signal? A device that can be damaged and broken and still, in its final moments, pick up the broadcast one last time? We are not ready to answer that question yet, but we are getting closer. And to continue this journey, we need to leave the hospital room and enter a different kind of territory. We need to talk about what happens to the body itself after the last breath. Because the physical reality of death is not poetic, it is not mystical, it is biology at its most honest, and understanding it changes the way you think about everything that comes after. Chapter 5. What the body does without you. We have spent the first 4 chapters exploring what the brain does as it dies. The gamma surges, the near-death visions, the spirit molecule, the impossible awakenings. But now, we need to turn our attention to something less mysterious and far more uncomfortable. What happens to the body after the person leaves it? Because whatever you believe about consciousness, whatever you think happens to the mind or the soul, The body has its own story, and that story is blunt, biological, and strangely beautiful. The moment the heart stops, a cascade of physical changes begins. Blood ceases, circulating, oxygen delivery halts, and cells, deprived of the energy they need to maintain their membranes and processes, to begin to die. But they do not die all at once. The process is gradual, organ by organ, cell by cell, and it happens in stages that forensic scientists have mapped with clinical precision. The first visible change is called pallor mortis. Within minutes of the heart stopping, the body begins to pale. Without circulation, blood drains from the capillaries near the surface of the skin, leaving a waxy, grayish-white appearance. This can happen within 15 to 30 minutes. At the same time, algor mortis begins. The body starts to cool. Without the metabolic heat generated by trillions of living cells, body temperature drops at a rate of roughly 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit per hour, slowly equalizing with the surrounding environment. In a cool room, a body can take 12 to 20 hours to reach ambient temperature. In extreme heat, the process is much faster. Within 20 minutes to 2 hours, livor mortis appears. Without the heart to push it along, blood obeys gravity. It pools in the lowest parts of the body, wherever they happen to be. If the body is lying on its back, the blood settles into the back, the buttocks, the shoulders, the calves. It creates dark, purplish discoloration that is visible through the skin. In forensic science, livor mortis is used to determine whether a body has been moved after death. If the lividity does not match the body's position, someone changed something. Then comes rigor mortis. Roughly 2 to 6 hours after death, the muscles begin to stiffen. Here is why. In a living body, muscles contract and relax through a chemical process that requires adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, the energy currency of the cell. When a muscle contracts, actin and myosin filaments slide together and lock. To release, ATP must bind to the myosin and break the connection. Without ATP, the connection cannot break. The muscles lock in place. Rigor mortis begins in the small muscles first, the eyelids, the jaw, the neck. It progresses downward through the body over roughly 12 hours until every muscle is stiff. It persists for 24 to 84 hours depending on temperature and other conditions. Eventually, as cellular decomposition progresses, the bonds break down and the body relaxes again. But even at this stage, not all the cells are dead. Some cells can survive hours after the heart stops. White blood cells in a corpse have been found alive for days. Skin cells can be cultured from cadavers up to 24 hours after death. The boundary between life and death is not a sharp line. It is a gradient, and then the body begins to consume itself. Without oxygen, cells become acidic. Their membranes rupture, and the enzymes that were once contained inside those cells, enzymes whose job it was to break down food and waste, spill out into the surrounding tissue and begin to digest whatever they touch. This process is called autolysis, self-digestion. The pancreas is usually the first organ to go. It is loaded with powerful digestive enzymes, enzymes designed to break down proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. In life, these enzymes are kept carefully contained. In death, they are released. The pancreas essentially digests itself. The liver follows. The brain, soft and rich in water, breaks down quickly. The intestines, already home to trillions of bacteria, begin to dissolve from the inside out. And that brings us to the second wave, the bacteria. In life, your immune system keeps your gut bacteria in check. Roughly 39 trillion bacterial cells live inside a healthy human body, mostly in the intestines. They are not invaders, they are partners. They help you digest food, produce vitamins, and train your immune system. But the moment the immune system shuts down, the partnership ends. The bacteria do not know you are dead. They only know that the barriers that once contained them are gone. The gut bacteria begin consuming the intestinal walls. They spread into the bloodstream, into the organs, into tissue they were never meant to reach. They produce gases as they feed, primarily hydrogen sulfide, methane, and ammonia. Within 3 to 5 days, these gases begin to bloat the body. The abdomen swells, the face puffs, the tongue may protrude, the body can swell to nearly twice its normal size. The gases also produce the characteristic chemicals of decomposition, putrescine and cadaverine, two molecules with names that tell you everything you need to know, are released in increasing quantities. A dark, foul-smelling fluid called purge fluid, a mixture of liquefied tissue, bacteria, and gas, is forced from the nose and mouth. Meanwhile, the outside world has found the body. Blowflies can detect the chemical signature of death from miles away. They arrive within hours, sometimes within minutes, landing on the body and laying eggs in the natural openings, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, any wound. The eggs hatch into maggots within 24 hours. Maggots are the most efficient biological decomposers on the planet. A mass of maggots can raise the temperature of a decomposing body by as much as 10 degrees Celsius through their collective metabolic activity. They consume soft tissue with remarkable speed. Active decay, the phase when the body loses the most mass, typically occurs between weeks 3 and 7. Organs and soft tissue liquefy, the skin darkens, and eventually sloughs off. The chemical byproducts of decomposition seep into the surrounding soil, creating what forensic anthropologists call a cadaver decomposition island, a zone of enriched soil that can persist for years. In warm, exposed conditions, a human body can be reduced to a skeleton in as few as 9 days. In temperate climates, the process takes weeks to months. In very cold or very dry environments, decomposition can be dramatically slowed. Mummification, either natural or deliberate, can preserve a body for thousands of years, but under normal conditions, the soft tissue is gone within months. Bones last longer. Protected by their mineral structure, bones can survive for centuries under the right conditions. But even bones are not permanent. Over thousands of years, they too are broken down by water, soil, chemistry, and microbial activity. Eventually, every atom that was once you is returned to the ecosystem. And here is where the science becomes strangely poetic. Every atom in your body was forged in the interior of a star. The carbon in your muscles, the calcium in your bones, the iron in your blood, all of it was created in the nuclear furnaces of stars that burned out and exploded billions of years ago. You are not just made of stardust as a metaphor. You are literally constructed from atoms that once existed inside dying stars. In death, those atoms do not vanish. They re-enter the cycle. Within a year of burial, the atoms that were once you are incorporated into soil, into plants, into water, into insects, into the bodies of other organisms. A single human body contains enough carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and other elements to sustain an entire meadow ecosystem. Your death feeds new life. Not poetically, chemically, measurably, literally. Research at forensic anthropology facilities, sometimes called body farms, has demonstrated that a decomposing body creates a burst of ecological activity. The soil beneath and around a body becomes dramatically enriched. Plant growth in these areas is more vigorous. Microbial diversity increases. The body, in death, becomes a source of life. The green burial movement and the emerging practice of human composting embrace this reality directly. Rather than embalming the with formaldehyde, sealing it in a metal casket, and placing it in a concrete vault, processes designed to resist decomposition as long as possible, green burial returns the body to the earth as a deliberate act of ecological continuation. Human composting, legalized in a growing number of places, accelerates the process, transforming a human body into nutrient-rich soil in roughly 30 to 60 days. In a purely materialist framework, this is the afterlife, not heaven, not reincarnation, redistribution. The atoms that were you become the grass, become the deer that eats the grass, become the soil that feeds the tree, become the air that fills another set of lungs. The cycle does not end, it transforms. But the physical story of what happens to the body is only half the story of death. Because long before modern science mapped the process of decomposition, long before forensic anthropology and microbiology, human beings were already asking the question that the body cannot answer. What happens to the part of you that is not the body? The oldest and most elaborate answer to that question comes from the banks of the Nile, from a civilization that spent more time, more wealth, and more creative energy on death than any other culture in human history. A civilization that believed the journey after death was not a metaphor. It was literal, it was dangerous, and it required a map. That civilization was ancient Egypt, and their map of the afterlife is our next destination. Chapter 6. The Weighing of the Heart. 4,000 years ago, on the banks of the Nile, a civilization built its entire culture around a single conviction. Death was not the end, it was a door. A dangerous, terrifying, magnificent door that opened onto a journey through the underworld. A journey that could lead to eternal paradise, or to the total annihilation of everything you ever were. The ancient Egyptians did not treat death as an abstraction. They treated it as an engineering problem. They mummified their bodies to preserve them for eternity. They filled their tombs with food, tools, furniture, jewelry, and weapons for the journey ahead. They wrote detailed instruction manuals for the dead, guides packed with spells, passwords, and warnings to help the deceased navigate the horrors that waited on the other side. To understand the Egyptian afterlife, you first need to understand what they believed a human being was, because in Egyptian thought, you were not one thing. You were many things woven together, and death unraveled them. The cow was your life essence, your vital force. It was the energy that made the difference between a living body and a corpse. The cow was born with you, it lived with you, and at the moment of death it separated from the body. It needed sustenance, it needed offerings of food and drink from the living. Without them, the cow would wither. This is why tombs contained storerooms filled with provisions. This is why families returned to tombs for generations, leaving offerings at altars. They were feeding the cow. The bar was your personality, your individual spirit. It was depicted in Egyptian art as a human-headed bird, because the bar was free. After death, the bar could fly between the world of the living and the world of the dead. It could visit the tomb, it could see the sun, it could travel through the afterlife. But the bar needed a home to return to, and that home was the preserved body. This is why mummification was so important. Without the body, the bar had nowhere to rest. The AK was the ultimate goal. When the cow and the bar were successfully reunited in the afterlife, they formed the AK, the transfigured, luminous, eternal being. The ache was what you became if you passed the tests. If you failed, you became nothing. The journey to becoming an AK was not easy. Between death and paradise lay the duat, the Egyptian underworld, and the duat was a nightmare. The duat was not a metaphorical concept. The Egyptians described it in visceral, terrifying detail. It was a vast labyrinth of caverns, rivers of fire, lakes of boiling liquid, and corridors guarded by creatures that defy imagination. Five-headed reptiles, serpents that breathed flame, gatekeepers with knives, demons with the heads of jackals and the bodies of serpents. At every gate, at every passage, at every turn, the dead faced a challenge, and the only way through was knowledge. To pass each gate, you had to speak the correct name of the guardian, you had to recite the correct spell, you had to answer questions truthfully. If you did not know the name, if you could not recite the spell, the guardian would destroy you. Your bar would be devoured, your car would dissolve, your name would be erased from existence. And, in Egyptian thought, to have your name erased was the worst fate imaginable. It meant you had never existed at all. This is why the Egyptians developed what we call the Book of the Dead. Its original name was the Chapters of Going Forth by Day. It was not a single book. It was a collection of roughly 192 known spells, hymns, instructions, and incantations written on papyrus scrolls and placed inside the coffin or wrapped within the mummy's bandages. No single copy contained all the spells. Wealthy Egyptians commissioned lavishly illustrated, personalized versions. Less wealthy individuals could purchase mass-produced copies with blank spaces where the scribe would fill in the deceased's name. The Book of the Dead evolved over centuries. Its earliest ancestors were the pyramid texts, dating to roughly 2,400 years before the Common Era, carved into the walls of royal tombs and available only to pharaohs. Over time, these became the coffin texts, accessible to the nobility. By the New Kingdom, around 1,550 before the Common Era, the Book of the Dead had become available to anyone who could afford a copy. Death in Egypt was democratic, at least on papyrus. Egyptologist Foy Scarf has noted that most of the spells in the Book of the Dead are not just navigational, they are transformational. They describe how to become a divine being, how to take on the form of a falcon or a lotus, how to speak with the gods. The Book of the Dead was not just a travel guide, it was a manual for metamorphosis. But the most famous scene in the entire Egyptian afterlife tradition is the one that waited at the end of the journey, the Hall of Mart, the Hall of Truth. When the deceased finally reached the Hall of Mart, they stood before the greatest tribunal in Egyptian mythology. Osiris, the god of the dead, and himself a resurrected king, sat on his throne. 42 divine judges lined the walls. The goddess Mart, the embodiment of truth, justice, and cosmic balance, presided over the proceedings. And Anubis, the jackal-headed god who guided the dead, stood beside a golden scale. The deceased was required to recite the negative confessions, a litany of 42 sins they claimed not to have committed. I have not stolen, I have not lied, I have not caused suffering, I have not taken what belongs to the gods. One by one, each denial was spoken aloud before the assembled judges. And then came the weighing. Anubis placed the heart of the deceased on one side of the scale. On the other side, he placed the white feather of Mart, the feather of truth. The heart, in Egyptian thought, was the seat of the soul. It contained the record of everything you had done, every act of kindness and every act of cruelty, every truth spoken and every lie told. If the heart was lighter than the feather, if the person had lived a life of sufficient truth and balance, the scale tipped in their favor. They were declared justified. They were permitted to enter the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise, Sekhet Aru, an idealized mirror of Egypt itself, eternal springtime, blue rivers, golden fields, boats sailing on calm water, unfailing harvests, blue skies without end. And Shabti servants, small figurines placed in the tomb, would magically come to life to perform any manual labor the deceased might be called upon to do. Even paradise had chores, but in paradise, someone else did them for you. But if the heart was heavier than the feather, if the person had lived a life burdened by cruelty and dishonesty, then Amit was waiting. Amit was a chimera, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus. She crouched beside the scale, and when the heart tipped against the dead, she devoured it. And with that, the person ceased to exist, not punished, not sent to a place of suffering, annihilated, erased completely, the final death, the death from which there was no return. Now consider this. Recall what near-death experience survivors describe, a panoramic life review in which they relive their entire existence, an experience of their actions evaluated not from their own perspective, but from the perspective of everyone they affected, a moral accounting, a weighing of the life lived. The Egyptian Hall of Mart is not identical to the modern near-death life review, but the structural parallels are striking. Both involve a moral evaluation of the entire life at the threshold of death. Both involve a judgment rendered not by an external authority, but by the weight of your own actions. Both result in one of two outcomes: continuation or dissolution. Did the ancient Egyptians encode something neurologically real into their mythology 4,000 years ago? Did they take the universal human experience of the dying brain, the life review, the moral evaluation, and dress it in the language of gods and scales and feathers? Or is this a coincidence, a cultural construction that happens to mirror the biology? We cannot know, but the pattern will keep appearing. because the Egyptians were not the only ones who mapped the afterlife in extraordinary detail. Half a world away, in the mountains of Tibet, another tradition created its own manual for the dead, a manual that describes the afterlife not as a physical journey through a dangerous underworld, but as a journey through the landscape of your own mind. A journey where everything you see, every god and every demon, every light and every shadow, is a projection of your own consciousness, and if you recognize that, you are free. Chapter 7. The Bardo Between lives in the mountains of Tibet. There is a book that is not meant for the living, it is meant for the dead. The Bardo Todol, known in the West as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, is one of the most extraordinary spiritual texts ever composed. Attributed to the 8th century Buddhist master Padmasambhava, though likely compiled in its current form in the 14th century, it was hidden as a treasure text, what the Tibetan tradition calls a terma, concealed until the world was ready to receive it. The book is not read in silence, it is read aloud. A lama or a family member sits beside the dying person and recites the text as the person takes their final breaths, and then continues reading for hours or days after the death. Because in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition the person can still hear, consciousness does not end at the moment of death, it transitions. It enters a gap between one life and the next. That gap is the bardo. The word itself means intermediate state. And according to the Bardo Todol, the bardo is the most important moment in all of existence. It is the moment when liberation from the cycle of birth and death is possible, if you recognize what is happening, if you understand what you are seeing. If you do not, you are pulled back into another life, another body, another round of suffering and forgetting. The Tibetan model of death is fundamentally different from the Egyptian one. In Egypt, the afterlife was a physical journey through a physical underworld. You fought monsters, you crossed rivers, you spoke passwords to gatekeepers, the dangers were external. In the Tibetan system, the afterlife is entirely internal. Everything you experience after death is a projection of your own mind. The gods are not real gods. The demons are not real demons. They are your own consciousness, reflected back at you with terrifying clarity. The Tibetan word for body is lu, which literally means what is left behind. The body is discarded, consciousness is what continues, and that consciousness passes through 3 stages, 3 bardos, each offering a chance at liberation. The first is the bardo of dying, called the Chikai bardo. This is the process of death itself, and the Tibetans describe it in extraordinary detail. As the body shuts down, the elements dissolve in sequence. Earth dissolves into water. You feel heavy, as if you are sinking into the ground. Your vision blurs. Water dissolves into fire. Your mouth dries. Your bodily fluids slow. Fire dissolves into air. Your body heat fades. Your breath becomes shallow and labored. Air dissolves into consciousness. The breath stops. And then, at the exact moment of final dissolution, something happens that the Tibetan tradition considers the most significant event in any life. The clear light appears. The clear light is described as the fundamental nature of reality itself, pure awareness, luminous, empty, boundless. It is not a light that you see, it is the light that you are. The Bardo Thodol describes it as the naked, unconditioned mind, free of all thought, all fear, all identity. If you recognize it, if you realize that this light is your own true nature, you are liberated on the spot. The cycle of birth and death ends, you merge with the infinite, but almost no one recognizes it, because the clear light is terrifying in its vastness. It is unfamiliar, it has no edges, no boundaries, no landmarks. Most consciousness, conditioned by a lifetime of habits and attachments, recoils from it. It is too much, too open, too naked, and so the mind pulls back and the second bardo begins. This is the bardo of Dharmata, the Chonyu bardo, and it is here that the visions begin. The Bardo Thodol describes waves of light and sound and color erupting in the consciousness of the dead. Peaceful deities appear first, radiating dazzling light in 5 colors, each associated with a different family of Buddhas and a different aspect of awakened consciousness. They are described as beautiful beyond imagination. Their face is serene, their bodies luminous. They invite you toward them. But alongside these peaceful visions, there are also terrifying ones. The wrathful deities appear. They are the same enlightened beings, but now wearing masks of ferocity. They have fangs. They are wreathed in flame. They brandish weapons and drink from skull cups filled with blood. They roar. They threaten. And they are just as much a projection of your own mind as the peaceful ones. The critical teaching of the Bardo Thodol is this: none of it is real. Not the peaceful deities, not the wrathful ones, not the lights, not the sounds, not the terrible visions. They are all projections of your own consciousness, reflections of your own mental habits and karmic patterns played back to you on a cosmic screen. If you recognize them as projections, if you see through the illusion, liberation is still possible even at this stage. But if fear takes over, if you run from the wrathful visions instead of recognizing them as yourself, you are pushed into the third and final stage, the bardo of becoming, the Siddha bardo. In the bardo of becoming, consciousness is confused, frightened, and disoriented. It is blown about by what the text calls the winds of karma, the accumulated momentum of all your actions, thoughts, and habits from your life. You can perceive the world of the living. You can see your family grieving. You can see your body being prepared for burial or cremation. But you cannot communicate. You cannot touch anything. You cannot be heard. And you begin to see flashes of your next life. You are drawn toward another birth. The text describes seeing couples in the act of union and being pulled toward them by desire or aversion. If you feel attraction to the female figure, you will be born male. If you feel attraction to the male, you will be born female. The Bardo Thodol provides detailed instructions at this stage for how to choose a favorable rebirth, what visions to approach and which to avoid, which lights to follow and which to resist. If all opportunities for liberation have been missed, consciousness enters a new womb, a new body forms, a new life begins, and the cycle continues. The psychoanalyst Carl Jung was deeply fascinated by the Bardo Thodol. He wrote a psychological commentary on the first Western translation, published in 1927 by Walter Evans Wentz. Jung saw the bardos not as literal metaphysical stages, but as descriptions of the unconscious mind, maps of the psyche in its rawest state. He found striking parallels between the contents of the Bardo visions and the archetypal imagery that appeared in the dreams and psychoses of his Western patients. And here is where the threads of our documentary begin to converge in a way that is difficult to dismiss. Compare the Bardo descriptions with what we know from neuroscience and psychedelic research. The dissolution of self. The DMT experience begins with the complete dissolution of ego, just as the Chikai Bardo describes the dissolution of the elements. A blinding, overwhelming light. Both DMT users and near-death experience survivors describe encountering light of impossible intensity and beauty. The clear light of the Bardo. Encounters with beings. DMT users consistently report meeting entities, presences, beings of extraordinary power and intelligence. The peaceful and wrathful deities of the Bardo. A moral evaluation. Near-death experience survivors describe the life review, a moral accounting of their actions, the karmic reckoning of the Siddha Bardo, a sense of ultimate reality. Across all these experiences, people report a feeling that what they are seeing is more real than the waking world. Not less real, more. The scholar Houston Smith wrote that everything we experience in the Bardo is a reflection of our own mental machinations. The Buddhist philosopher Carl Becker went further, arguing that the heavens, judgments, and ghostly scenarios described by other religious traditions have equal claims to validity. The afterlife, he suggested, is culturally relative insofar as its imagery is projected by the perceiver. In other words, maybe the Egyptians and the Tibetans and the near-death survivors and the DMT volunteers are all describing the same thing, the same underlying event, the same neurological process, dressed in different costumes depending on the culture, the era, and the expectations of dying mind. Or maybe they are describing something that is genuinely there, something that exists beyond the brain, beyond culture, beyond biology. Something that every human civilization from the banks of the Nile to the peaks of the Himalayas has been trying to map for as long as our species has been aware of its own mortality. The Egyptians and the Tibetans gave the most detailed maps, but they were far from the only ones. In the frozen north, the Norse imagined a great hall where the war dead feasted for eternity. In the Mediterranean, the Greeks built a shadowy bureaucracy beneath the earth. And on every continent, in every era, in every language, human beings have imagined what lies beyond the final breath. Those visions of the afterlife are where we turn next. The Norse did not promise eternity, they promised a job. In the mythology of the Viking Age, the afterlife was not a reward for good behavior. It was not a place of rest. It was preparation for the end of everything. The Norse believed that the universe itself would die, that a final battle called Ragnarok would consume the gods, the giants, the monsters, and the world tree Yggdrasil that held all of creation together. The sun would be swallowed by a great wolf named Fenrir. The serpent Jormungandr would rise from the ocean and poison the sky. Odin, the All-Father, would fall. Thor would fall. The earth would sink into the sea, and the afterlife existed to get ready for that day. When a Norse warrior died in battle, the Valkyries came. These were the choosers of the slain, beautiful and terrifying women who rode winged horses across the battlefield and selected the bravest of the fallen. Half of the chosen were taken to Valhalla, the great hall of Odin. The other half went to Folkvangra, the field of the goddess Freyja. Valhalla was enormous. Its rafters were made of spears, its roof tiles were golden shields. It had 540 doors, each wide enough for 800 warriors to march through side by side. Every day, the warriors of Valhalla, the Einherjar, rose at dawn, put on their armor, and fought each other to the death. Every evening, the dead rose again, their wounds healed, and they sat down to an endless feast. They ate the flesh of a boar named Serimnir, who was cooked and consumed each night and magically restored each morning. They drank mead that flowed from the udders of a goat named Hydron, who fed on the leaves of the world tree. It was not paradise. It was boot camp. The warriors were training, they were preparing for Ragnarok, the final battle at the end of all things, when they would march through those 540 doors and fight alongside the gods against the forces of chaos. And they would lose. The Norse knew they would lose. Ragnarok was not a possibility. It was a certainty. The gods would die, the heroes would die, the world would burn, and from the ashes, perhaps, something new would begin. But Valhalla was not the only destination. Those who did not die in battle went to hell, and hell in Norse mythology was not punishment. It was simply the default. Hell was presided over by a goddess also named Hel, described as half alive and half dead, with one side of her body living flesh and the other side rotting corpse. Her realm was cold, dim, and joyless, but it was not torture, it was existence, without glory, without purpose, without the honor of a warrior's death. The Norse afterlife was unique among world mythologies because it was organized not around morality, but around the manner of death. It did not matter whether you were kind or cruel, honest or deceitful. What mattered was how you died. A warrior who fell in battle went to Valhalla. A farmer who died of old age in his bed went to hell. The same person, depending on their final moment, could end up in either place. Viking funeral practices reflected this worldview. Ship burials placed the dead in vessels stocked with weapons, food, animals, and sometimes sacrificed servants, provisions for the journey and the battle to come. Cremation released the spirit from the body. The flames were not destruction, they were transportation. Now travel south, cross the Alps, follow the Mediterranean coastline to the world of ancient Greece, where death was imagined very differently. The Greek underworld was not a battlefield, it was a bureaucracy. When a Greek died, the soul descended beneath the earth to the realm of Hades, a god so feared that the Greeks rarely spoke his name. The border between the living and the dead was a river, the Styx, and to cross it you needed a ferryman. His name was Charon. He was old, he was grim, and he required payment. A coin, an obol, was placed in the mouth or on the eyes of the dead before burial. Without the coin, you could not cross. You would wander the near shore of the Styx for eternity, unable to enter the underworld and unable to return to the living. Once across, the soul was judged. 3 judges, Minos, Rhadamanthys, and Arcas, evaluated the life of the dead and assigned them to one of 3 destinations. Elysium, the Elysian Fields, was paradise, reserved for heroes, the virtuous, and those favored by the gods. Elysium was a land of eternal sunlight, gentle breezes, and effortless joy. It was rare, few qualified. The Asphodel Meadows were the default destination, the Greek equivalent of hell. This was where ordinary souls went, people who were neither great nor terrible. The Asphodel Meadows were grey, quiet, and endlessly monotonous, not suffering, not joy, just existence, a faded echo of life. And Tartarus was the pit, reserved for the truly wicked and for those who had personally offended the gods. Tartarus was a place of eternal punishment. Sisyphus pushed his boulder up the hill forever, watching it roll back down each time he neared the summit. Tantalus stood in a pool of water beneath branches heavy with fruit, but the water receded when he bent to drink, and the fruit pulled away when he reached for it. Eternal proximity to what you desire, eternal denial. Unlike the Norse system, the Greek afterlife was morally structured. Your destination was determined by how you lived, not how you died. But, like the Norse system, it was permanent. There was no redemption in Hades, no second chance. Death was a one-way door. The Greeks embedded death into the cycle of nature through their myths. Persephone, the daughter of Demeter, was abducted by Hades and taken to the underworld. Demeter's grief caused the earth to become barren. A compromise was reached. Persephone would spend part of the year in the underworld and part on the surface. When she descended, winter came. When she returned, spring, death, and renewal. Descent and return. The oldest story in the world. Orpheus, the greatest musician who ever lived, descended into the underworld to retrieve his dead wife Eurydice. His music charmed Hades and Persephone, and they agreed to release her on one condition. Orpheus must walk ahead and not look back until they reached the surface. He almost made it. At the last moment, overcome by doubt, he turned, and Eurydice was pulled back into the darkness forever. The myth of Orpheus is a story about the impossibility of reversing death, about the human desire to bring back what is lost, and about the terrible price of doubt at the threshold. These 2 traditions, the Norse and the Greek, are among the most well-documented afterlife mythologies in the Western world, but they are far from the only ones. In ancient Mesopotamia, the dead descended to Kua, a dark, dusty underworld where all souls, regardless of virtue, lived as shadowy versions of themselves, eating clay and drinking dirty water. In Hindu tradition, the god of death, Yama, guides the soul to Yamaloka for judgment, and the soul is reborn according to the karma accumulated in life. In Chinese tradition, the dead pass through Diyu, a multi-layered underworld where they are judged and punished for specific sins before being reincarnated. In Aztec tradition, the dead traveled to Mictlan, the deepest level of the underworld, navigating 9 challenging layers over 4 years before reaching their final rest. In indigenous Australian traditions, the spirit returns to the dreaming, the eternal creative dimension that underlies and generates physical reality. And across all of these traditions, despite the vast differences in culture, geography, language, and era, certain patterns recur with eerie consistency. A journey or crossing, a river, a bridge, a tunnel, a passage from one realm to another, guides, Anubis in Egypt, Hermes in Greece, the Valkyries in Scandinavia, Yama in Hindu tradition, beings whose role is to escort the dead to their destination. The technical term is psychopomp, a guide of souls, moral judgment or evaluation, the weighing of the heart, the life review, the 3 judges of Hades, the karmic accounting, multiples possibles destinations, paradis or annihilation, Elysium or Tartarus, Valhalla or hell, heaven or dissolution. and the importance of proper death rites performed by the living, coins for Charon, offerings for the Ka, prayers read aloud in the Bardo, funeral pyres for the Norse. These patterns predate contact between cultures. The Aztecs never met the Egyptians, the Aboriginal Australians never met the Greeks, the Norse never met the Hindus, and yet they all arrived at the same basic architecture for the afterlife: a journey, a guide, a judgment, a destination. Why? There are two possible explanations. The first is neurological. If the dying brain generates a consistent set of experiences, as the gamma wave studies and near-death research suggest, then every culture is simply encoding the same biological event in different symbolic language. The tunnel is universal because the optic nerve misfires the same way in every human brain. The life review is universal because the hippocampus activates the same way in every dying cortex. The beings of light are universal because gamma surges in the temporoparietal occipital junction produce the same hallucinations regardless of whether you worship Osiris or Odin. The second explanation is that they are all describing something real, something that exists beyond culture, beyond biology, beyond the physical structure of the brain, something that every human civilization has glimpsed at the threshold of death and tried to capture in myth and ritual and sacred architecture. We cannot yet determine which explanation is correct, but the pattern is there and it does not stop with the ancient world. The three largest religions on earth today, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, collectively followed by over 4 billion people, have their own answers to the question of what happens after death, and their answers share more with the ancient traditions than most believers realize. Chapter 9, The Abrahamic Answer. Roughly 4 billion people alive today follow one of three religions that trace their origins to the patriarch Abraham, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. Between them, they account for more than half the population of the earth, and all three have placed death at the very center of their theology. Christianity is the largest religion on the planet, with approximately 2.4 billion adherents, and its entire theological structure revolves around a single event, a death, and what came after it. The central claim of Christianity is that Jesus of Nazareth, crucified by the Roman authorities in approximately 33 of the Common Era, rose from the dead 3 days later. This resurrection is not treated as a metaphor or a spiritual teaching. In mainstream Christian doctrine, it is a historical event. The body that was placed in the tomb walked out of it, and this event, Christians believe, changed the nature of death forever. Because of the resurrection, Christianity teaches that death is not the end for anyone. At the second coming of Christ, all the dead will be raised, not just their souls, their bodies. This is the doctrine of bodily resurrection, and it distinguishes Christianity from many other afterlife traditions. The promise is not just spiritual survival, it is physical restoration, a new body, a glorified body, a body freed from disease, decay, and death. Upon resurrection, the dead face judgment. The righteous are granted eternal life in the presence of God. The unrighteous are separated from God permanently. The precise nature of this separation varies enormously across Christian traditions. Some interpret it as literal fire and eternal torment. Others interpret it as the absence of God's presence, a spiritual condition rather than a physical punishment. The Catholic tradition includes purgatory, a temporary state of purification where souls that are destined for heaven are cleansed of remaining sin. Protestant traditions generally reject purgatory, holding that salvation is determined at the moment of death. The Western imagination of heaven and the other place has been profoundly shaped by a poem. In 1320, the Italian poet Dante Alighieri completed the Divine Comedy, a journey through 3 realms of the afterlife, 9 concentric circles of descent, each punishing a different category of sin with increasing severity, and 9 celestial spheres of heaven, ascending toward the ultimate vision of God. Dante's vision was literary, not doctrinal, but its influence on the Christian imagination has been incalculable. When most people in the Western world picture the afterlife, they are picturing something closer to Dante than to the Bible itself. The Bible's own descriptions of the afterlife are remarkably sparse. Jesus speaks of the kingdom of God, of many mansions in his Father's house, of outer darkness, and weeping and gnashing of teeth. But the detailed geography that most Christians carry in their minds comes from centuries of theological elaboration and artistic interpretation built upon these relatively brief passages. Islam is the world's second largest religion, with approximately 1.9 billion adherents. Its eschatology, its theology of the end times and the afterlife, is among the most detailed of any world religion, described in extensive passages in the Quran and elaborated further in the Hadith, the collected sayings and traditions of the Prophet Muhammad. In Islamic teaching, the moment a person dies, the soul enters an intermediate state called the barzakh. This is not the final destination. It is a waiting room. In the grave, two angels named Munkar and Nakir visit the deceased and ask three questions. Who is your Lord? What is your religion? Who is this man who is sent among you? The righteous answer correctly and are shown a glimpse of paradise. The wicked cannot answer and are shown a glimpse of their punishment. The barzakh continues until the day of judgment, when all souls are resurrected and brought before God for final accounting. The imagery of that day is vivid. Every person's deeds are recorded in a book. The book is opened, and the deeds are weighed on a cosmic scale called the mizan. Good deeds on one side, sins on the other. The parallel to the Egyptian weighing of the heart is striking. A scale, a moral accounting. The weight of your life measured against a standard of divine justice. Different cultures, different centuries, different continents, same structure. After the weighing, the dead must cross as sirat, a bridge over the fires of punishment. The bridge is described in the Hadith as thinner than a hair and sharper than a sword. The righteous cross it with ease, some at the speed of lightning. The wicked stumble and fall. The bridge is not a metaphor. In Islamic tradition, it is a real test, a physical crossing that separates the saved from the condemned. Paradise in Islam is called Jannah, and it is described with lavish sensory detail. Gardens beneath which rivers flow, rivers of water, of milk, of honey, and of wine that does not intoxicate. Fruits of every kind, garments of silk, reunion with loved ones, and the greatest reward of all, the beatific vision, seeing the face of God. The punishment of Jahannam is described with equal specificity. Fire, boiling water, chains, trees with fruit like the heads of demons. The suffering is proportional to the sins committed. Among Islamic scholars, there is active debate about whether Jahannam is eternal for all its inhabitants, or whether Muslim sinners serve a finite sentence before being admitted to paradise. The majority view holds that believers will eventually be released, while those who rejected faith entirely face permanent separation from God. Judaism, the oldest of the three Abrahamic faiths, takes a notably different approach. Where Christianity and Islam provide elaborate maps of the afterlife, Judaism largely declines to draw one. The Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, contains remarkably few references to what happens after death. The word Sheol appears throughout the text, but it is not a place of punishment. It is a shadowy, indistinct realm where the dead exist in a diminished state. The Psalms describe Sheol as a place of silence, where the dead do not praise God. It is closer to the Greek asphodel meadows than to any concept of heaven or perdition. Later Jewish thought, particularly in the rabbinic period, developed more detailed concepts. Ulam haba, the world to come, is a future state of perfection that will be established after the coming of the Messiah. Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, is a paradise for the righteous. And Gehinnom is a purgatorial state, but unlike the Christian concept of punishment, it is typically described as lasting no more than 12 months. It is a process of spiritual cleansing, not eternal torment. The resurrection of the dead is part of traditional Jewish belief. It appears in the 13 Principles of Faith, compiled by the medieval philosopher Maimonides, but the details are left deliberately vague. Judaism's emphasis is consistently on how to live, not on mapping the afterlife. There is a famous Talmudic attitude that captures this perfectly. We were given the Torah for this world. Let God take care of the next. Now step back and look at all three traditions together. Despite their theological differences, the structural similarities are remarkable. All three feature a moral judgment after death. All three include an intermediate state between death and the final reckoning. All three describe a weighing or evaluation of deeds. All three promise a paradise for the righteous and consequences for the wicked. All three affirm bodily resurrection in some form. And all three rest on the same Near Eastern cultural foundation that produced the Egyptian Hall of Mart thousands of years before any of them existed. The scales of Anubis and the Mizan of Islam, the negative confessions and the Last Judgment, the field of reeds and Jannah, the patterns rhyme across millennia. 4 billion people live their lives according to these answers. They shape their morality, their relationships, their hopes and their fears around the conviction that death is not the end, that what you do in this life determines what happens in the next, that someone is watching, that the scales are real. Whether these beliefs are true descriptions of an actual afterlife or cultural elaborations of a universal neurological experience, they carry real weight in the real world. They comfort the dying. They restrain the living. They give meaning to suffering and hope to grief, and they have done so for thousands of years. But there is another way to approach the question of what happens after death, not through religion, not through mythology, through the deepest and most unsettling question in all of science, a question that no laboratory has answered, a question that no equation has solved, a question so fundamental that it undermines everything we think we know about the relationship between the brain and the mind. What is consciousness? Where does it come from? And can it survive the destruction of the organ that appears to produce it? Chapter 10. The Hard Problem. In 1995, a philosopher named David Chalmers stood before a room full of scientists and asked a question that none of them could answer. He called it the hard problem of consciousness, and 3 decades later, it remains unsolved. The question is simple. Why does subjective experience exist at all? We can map the brain down to the individual neuron. We can track electrical signals across the cortex in real time. We can identify which regions activate when you see red, taste chocolate, hear music, or feel grief. We can describe the mechanics of consciousness with extraordinary precision, but we cannot explain the one thing that matters most. Why is there something it is like to be you? When light hits your retina, photoreceptor cells convert it into electrical signals. Those signals travel through the optic nerve to the visual cortex, where they are processed through a hierarchy of neural circuits that extract edges, colors, motion, and depth. We can describe every step of that process, but none of it explains why you experience the color red, why there is a qualitative, subjective feeling associated with seeing it, why you do not simply process the light the way a camera does, recording the wavelength without experiencing anything at all. Chalmers distinguished between the easy problems of consciousness and the hard problem. The easy problems are not actually easy, they are enormously complex. But they are easy in principle, because they are problems about function. How does the brain process sensory information? How does it integrate data from different modalities? How does it direct attention? How does it generate behavior? These are engineering questions. With enough time and technology, we can answer them. The hard problem is different. The hard problem asks why any of that functional processing is accompanied by experience. Why is there an inner life? Why are we not what Chalmers called philosophical zombies, biological machines that process information and generate behavior identically to conscious beings, but without any subjective experience? From the outside, a zombie would be indistinguishable from a conscious person. It would walk, talk, laugh, cry, and claim to have feelings. But inside, there would be nothing, no one home. The mainstream view in neuroscience, and the dominant view in Western science since the Enlightenment, is that consciousness is produced by the brain. It is a product of neural activity. When neurons fire in certain patterns, consciousness emerges the way wetness emerges from water molecules. It is what the brain does, the way digestion is what the stomach does. Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA, put it bluntly in his 1994 book, The Astonishing Hypothesis. You, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will, are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. You are nothing but a pack of neurons. This is the materialist position. Consciousness equals brain activity. Destroy the brain, destroy consciousness. Death is the permanent end of subjective experience. It is a powerful framework. It is supported by enormous amounts of evidence. Brain injuries change personality. Drugs alter consciousness. Specific brain regions are reliably associated with specific mental functions. Damage to the hippocampus destroys the ability to form new memories. Damage to the fusiform gyrus destroys the ability to recognize faces. Damage to Broca's area destroys the ability to produce speech. The correlation between brain structure and mental function is so consistent and so well documented that most neuroscientists consider it case closed. The brain makes the mind, but there is a problem, and the problem has been growing for decades. Despite more than a century of neuroscience, despite brain imaging technology that can track neural activity at the millisecond level, despite the mapping of the entire human genome and the identification of genes associated with neurological function, no one has produced a off-consciousness that explains how subjective experience arises from physical processes. The correlation between brain activity and conscious experience is beyond dispute, but correlation is not causation. And the explanatory gap between neural activity and subjective experience remains as wide as it was when Chalmers named it in 1995. This is not a fringe concern. It is acknowledged by leading neuroscientists. Christoph Koch, the former chief scientist of the Allen Institute for Brain Science and one of the most prominent consciousness researchers in the world, has described the problem as the most fundamental, unsolved question in all of science. We know more about the physics of black holes than we do about the nature of the experience you are having right now as you listen to these words. And into this gap, a very old idea has been re-emerging. Not from mystics or philosophers, but from the edges of mainstream science. The idea that the brain does not generate consciousness, it receives it. The brain, as receiver hypothesis, is not new. William James, the father of American psychology, proposed a version of it in 1898. He argued that the brain may transmit consciousness the way a prism transmits light. The prism shapes the light. It filters it, it breaks it into colors. But the prism does not create the light. The light exists independently. Destroy the prism, and the light is not destroyed. It simply passes through unfiltered. Aldous Huxley expanded on this idea in the 1950s. He proposed that the brain functions as a reducing valve, filtering the overwhelming totality of consciousness down to a manageable trickle that allows us to survive in the physical world. Psychedelic drugs, he suggested, temporarily open the valve, allowing more of the signal through. And death, he speculated, removes the valve entirely. This hypothesis remains a minority view in neuroscience. Most researchers consider it unfalsifiable and therefore unscientific. But it has never been refuted. And certain observations we have already discussed in this documentary, are very difficult to explain under the standard materialist model. Terminal lucidity. A brain destroyed by decades of Alzheimer's disease, suddenly producing perfect cognition. If consciousness is generated by neural circuits, and those circuits are physically destroyed, how does the mind come back? Verified near-death perceptions. Patients accurately describing events that occurred while their brains were flatlined. If consciousness requires a functioning brain, how did they acquire information when the brain was not functioning? The measurement problem in quantum physics. At the quantum level, the act of observation appears to affect physical reality. Particles exist in superpositions of multiple states until they are measured. The observer, in some interpretations of quantum mechanics, is not a passive recorder of reality. The big server is a participant in creating it. One of these observations proved the receiver hypothesis. None of them disprove materialism, but they create cracks. And through those cracks, questions leak in. If consciousness is generated by the brain, then death is annihilation. The generator is destroyed. The electricity stops. The lights go out. Nothing remains. If consciousness is received or filtered by the brain, then death is the destruction of the receiver, not the signal. The radio breaks. The music does not stop. It simply is no longer being translated into a form we can hear. Neither position has been scientifically proven. The materialist position is an assumption supported by correlation, not a demonstrated mechanism. The receiver position is a hypothesis supported by anomalies, not a demonstrated mechanism. We do not know which is true, but one Nobel Prize-winning physicist believed that the answer might lie in a place no one had thought to look, inside the smallest structures of the cells that make up your brain. In the quantum vibrations of protein tubes, so tiny, they exist at the boundary between classical physics and the strange probabilistic world of quantum mechanics. His theory is controversial. His predictions are being tested right now in laboratories around the world. And if he is right, consciousness is not a byproduct of computation. It is woven into the fabric of the universe itself. Chapter 11. The Quantum Soul. In the 1990s, two scientists from very different fields formed an unlikely partnership. One was Roger Penrose, a mathematician and physicist at the University of Oxford, a man who would go on to win the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2020 for his work proving that black holes are a necessary consequence of general relativity. The other was Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist at the University of Arizona, a man who had spent his career studying the mechanics of how the brain loses and regains consciousness under anesthesia. Together, they proposed a theory of consciousness that shocked the scientific world. They called it orchestrated objective reduction, OR, and at its core was a claim that most neuroscientists considered absurd. Consciousness, they argued, does not emerge from the computational complexity of neural networks. It arises from quantum processes occurring inside tiny structures within neurons called microtubules. Microtubules are hollow protein cylinders found in virtually every cell in your body. They are part of the cytoskeleton, the internal scaffolding that gives cells their shape and structure. For decades, they were considered purely structural, the beams and girders of cellular architecture. But Hameroff had noticed something. Microtubules do far more than hold cells together. They regulate synaptic connections, they control cell growth and division, they transport materials within the cell, and, in neurons specifically, they play a role in how signals are processed and transmitted. Hameroff also noticed something else. When you go under general anesthesia, you lose consciousness. The anesthetic molecules do not shut down your brain. Your neurons keep firing, your brainstem keeps your heart beating, and your lungs breathing. But consciousness vanishes, and many anesthetic agents, Hameroff observed, bind specifically to microtubules. They interact with the proteins inside these structures. Could microtubules be the seat of consciousness rather than just structural support? Penrose brought the physics. He had long been troubled by a problem in quantum mechanics. In the quantum world, particles can exist in superpositions, simultaneously occupying multiple states until they are observed or measured, at which point they collapse into a single definite state. This is the famous measurement problem. Penrose proposed that this collapse, this reduction from many possibilities to one definite reality, is not caused by observation alone. It is caused by an objective physical process related to the curvature of space-time at quantum scales. He called this objective reduction. Combine Hameroff's microtubules with Penrose's physics, and you get OR. The theory proposes that quantum superpositions build up within the tubulin proteins of microtubules inside neurons. These superpositions are not random. They are orchestrated by biological processes, by the computational activity of the neural network. When the superpositions reach a critical threshold, determined by quantum gravity, they collapse. They undergo objective reduction. And each collapse is a moment of conscious experience. In this framework, consciousness is not something the brain computes. It is something the brain tunes into. Each moment of awareness is a quantum event, a collapse of possibility into actuality, occurring billions of times per second across billions of microtubules in billions of neurons. Consciousness is not an emergent property of complexity. It is a fundamental feature of the universe, and the brain is the instrument that accesses it. The scientific community reacted with intense skepticism. The main objection was environmental. The brain is warm, wet, and noisy. Quantum coherence, the maintenance of quantum superpositions, was believed to be impossible in such an environment. Quantum effects were thought to require near absolute zero temperatures and total isolation from external disturbance. A brain at 37 degrees Celsius, saturated in biochemical activity, seemed like the last place you would find quantum processes. For years, Ochoa was treated as an interesting but implausible speculation. And then the evidence started to arrive. In 2024, researchers at Wellesley College conducted an experiment with rats. They administered a drug called epithalone B, which binds to and stabilizes microtubules. The rats that received the drug took over a minute longer to lose consciousness under anesthesia compared to control animals. If microtubules were purely structural, stabilizing them should not affect the onset of anesthesia, but it did. The implication was that microtubules play an active role in maintaining consciousness. In 2025, Hameroff and colleagues published a paper in Neuroscience of Consciousness, an Oxford University press journal, presenting what they described as direct experimental evidence of quantum effects in microtubules at room temperature. The paper also presented magnetic resonance, imaging evidence, suggesting the existence of a macroscopic quantum state related to consciousness in the human brain. The same paper argued that Ochoa solves two long-standing problems in the science of consciousness. The binding problem, which asks how the brain combines disparate sensory inputs, sight, sound, touch, smell, into a single unified conscious experience. And the problem of epiphenomenalism, which asks how consciousness, if it is merely a byproduct of physical processes, can have any causal effect on the physical world. If consciousness is a quantum phenomenon, it operates at the most fundamental level of physical reality and can influence events through quantum effects. What about the objection that the brain is too warm and noisy for quantum coherence? Recent research in quantum biology has been steadily undermining that assumption. Quantum coherence has been demonstrated in photosynthesis, in the navigation systems of migratory birds, and in the olfactory system that allows you to distinguish smells. Biology, it turns out, may have evolved to exploit quantum effects in warm, wet environments. The brain may be no exception. In Italy, the underground Gran Sasso National Laboratory tested gravity-related quantum collapse models. The simplest version of these models was ruled out by the experimental data, but Penrose's original formulation was not excluded. Refined models consistent with Ochoa remain viable. The door is open. Now, here is what this means for death. If consciousness is a quantum phenomenon, if it arises from quantum processes in microtubules, then the information that constitutes your conscious experience is fundamentally quantum in nature. And one of the most profound principles of quantum mechanics is that quantum information cannot be destroyed. It can be transformed, it can be scattered, it can be scrambled beyond any practical hope of recovery, but it cannot be annihilated. Hameroff has speculated openly about the implications. When a person dies, he has said, the quantum information in their microtubules does not disappear, it dissipates into the universe. If the patient is resuscitated, that quantum information can flow back into the microtubules and the person reports a near-death experience. If the patient is not resuscitated, the quantum information exists outside the body, perhaps indefinitely, as what Hameroff has called a soul. Penrose himself is more cautious. He does not endorse the soul language. He has said that the relationship between consciousness and quantum gravity is something that we are only beginning to understand. But he has not dismissed the possibility that consciousness has a deeper relationship to the physical universe than current neuroscience assumes. Ochoa remains deeply contested. Many neuroscientists consider it speculative at best, but it is the only theory of consciousness that makes specific, testable predictions about the relationship between quantum physics and subjective experience. And those predictions are being tested right now in labs around the world. We are in the if it does, the implications for death are staggering. Because if consciousness is not generated by the brain but accessed through it, if it is woven into the fabric of space-time itself, then the death of the brain is not the death of consciousness. It is the destruction of the antenna. The signal continues, and there is one more theory we need to examine. A theory proposed not by a physicist or a philosopher, but by a biologist. A stem cell researcher named one of the 100 most influential people in the world by Time magazine. A man who looked at quantum mechanics, looked at consciousness, looked at the nature of reality itself, and arrived at a conclusion so radical that it overturns everything we think we know about the relationship between life and the universe. His name is Robert Lanza, and his theory says that death does not exist at all. Chapter 12. Death is an illusion. Robert Lanza is not a mystic. He is not a philosopher. He is a scientist, a stem cell researcher whose work has been recognized by the National Institutes of Health, the National Academy of Sciences, and Time magazine, which named him one of the 100 most influential people in the world in 2014. He has published hundreds of peer-reviewed papers. He has pioneered techniques in regenerative medicine. His credentials in mainstream biology are impeccable. And in 2009, he published a book that proposed something that most of his colleagues considered outrageous. The book was called Biocentrism, and its central claim was this: life and consciousness are not products of the universe. They are the foundations of it. The conventional view of reality goes like this. The universe came first, 14 billion years ago. The Big Bang created space, time, matter, and energy. Over billions of years, stars formed, planets coalesced, chemistry became biology, and eventually, on at least one small planet orbiting an ordinary star, life emerged. Consciousness is a late arrival, a product of evolution, an emergent property of sufficiently complex brains. The universe does not need consciousness. Consciousness is an accident, a byproduct, a passenger on a bus that was going somewhere anyway. Lanza turned this entirely upside down. He argued that consciousness does not emerge from the universe. The universe emerges from consciousness. Space and time are not objective realities that exist independently of observation. They are tools of biological perception. They are the way consciousness organizes its experience. Without an observer, Lanza argued, space and time have no independent existence. This sounds like philosophy, but Lanza grounded his argument in physics, specifically in the most famous experiment in quantum mechanics, the double-slit experiment. Here is the experiment in its simplest form. You fire individual particles, photons, or electrons at a barrier with two slits in it. Behind the barrier is a detection screen that records where each particle lands. If particles are just particles, little bullets of matter, you would expect to see two bands on the screen, one behind each slit, but that is not what happens. The particles create an interference pattern, a series of alternating light and dark bands that is characteristic of waves. Each particle, somehow, passes through both slits simultaneously, interferes with itself, and lands in a pattern that only makes sense if it traveled as a wave. But here is where it gets strange. If you set up a detector at the slits to observe which slit each particle passes through, the interference pattern disappears. The particles behave like particles again. Two bands, no wave pattern. The act of observation changes the behavior of the system. This is not disputed. It has been replicated thousands of times in laboratories around the world. It is one of the most well-established results in all of physics, and it raises a question that physics has never satisfactorily answered. What role does the observer play in determining reality? Lanza took this question and ran with it. If observation affects reality at the quantum level, and if the quantum level is the foundation of all physical reality, then the observer is not separate from the universe. The observer is integral to it. Consciousness is not a product of the physical world. The physical world is a product of consciousness. And if consciousness is fundamental, if it is the ground floor of reality rather than the penthouse, then it cannot be destroyed by the death of any particular biological body. The body is a temporary vehicle. Consciousness is what drives it. When the vehicle breaks down, the driver does not disappear. Lanza combined this with the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, a mainstream interpretation proposed by physicist Hugh Everett in 1957. The many worlds interpretation holds that every quantum event causes the universe to split into multiple branches, each representing a different possible outcome. In this framework, every possible version of reality exists simultaneously in an infinite branching tree of parallel universes. Lanza's extension was elegant and unsettling. When you die in one branch of the multiverse, consciousness simply continues in another branch, where you are still alive. Death is real for the body. It is not real for consciousness. From the perspective of the observer, from the perspective of the mind, death never happens. You simply find yourself in the next moment, in another version of reality where the fatal event did not occur. He found support for this idea in an unlikely place, in a letter written by Albert Einstein. In 1955, Einstein's lifelong friend, Michel Besseau, died. Einstein wrote a condolence letter to Besseau's family that has become one of the most quoted passages in the history of physics. Now Besseau has departed from this strange world a little ahead of me, Einstein wrote. That means nothing. People like us know that the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. Einstein was not being mystical. He was being precise. In the framework of relativity, which Einstein himself created, time does not flow the way we experience it. Past, present, and future all exist simultaneously in what physicists call the block universe. The distinction between them is a feature of perception, not of physics. Death, in this view, is an event that occurs at a specific point in space-time. But the person exists at other points in space-time as well. And from the perspective of physics, all of those points are equally real. Lanza also pointed to the first law of thermodynamics. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only change form. The human brain generates roughly 20 watts of electrochemical energy. When the brain dies, that energy does not vanish. It must take another form. It dissipates as heat. It is absorbed by the surrounding environment. But it does not cease to exist. Energy is conserved. The criticism of biocentrism has been fierce. Theoretical physicist Lawrence Krauss dismissed it, saying he saw no scientific breakthroughs in the theory. Philosopher Daniel Dennett called it the opposite of a theory, arguing that Lanza does not explain how consciousness happens at all. And many physicists have pointed out that the role of the observer in quantum mechanics is far more nuanced than Lanza's account suggests. The observer in quantum mechanics does not have to be a conscious being, a detector, a piece of measuring equipment. Anything that interacts with a quantum system can cause wave function collapse. Consciousness may not be special in the way Lanza claims. These are legitimate criticisms. Biocentrism remains more philosophy than testable science. It makes few predictions that can be experimentally verified or falsified. And in science, a theory that cannot be tested is a theory that cannot be confirmed. But biocentrism does something that mainstream physics has failed to do. It takes the observer problem seriously. It takes the hard problem of consciousness seriously. It synthesizes quantum mechanics, consciousness, research, and the nature of time into a coherent framework that addresses the deepest questions about reality and death. And for many people, it offers what religions have always offered: the possibility that death is not the end, but framed in the language of science rather than faith. Whether through quantum mechanics, biocentrism, or Buddhist philosophy, a growing number of frameworks propose that consciousness is more fundamental than matter, that the universe is not a machine that accidentally produced minds, that minds are the foundation upon which the universe is built, and that death, whatever it does to the body, may not touch the thing that matters most. But we should not get lost in theory, because there is one thing that science knows for certain about what happens after death. One thing that is measurable, observable, and undeniable. And it is not about consciousness, or souls, or quantum mechanics. It is about atoms, about the physical stuff you are made of, and what happens to it when you are gone. Chapter 13, The Recycling of You. Let us talk about what we know, not what we believe, not what we hope, not what we theorize, what we know. Because after 12 chapters of gamma waves and spirit molecules and quantum souls and ancient underworlds, it is worth returning to the ground, to the solid, measurable, undeniable facts of physics and biology. The first law of thermodynamics states that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only change form. This is not a theory. It is one of the most fundamental and well-tested principles in all of science. No experiment has ever violated it. No observation has ever contradicted it. Energy is conserved. Always. Your body is energy. Every cell, every molecule, every atom in you is a form of energy organized into a specific pattern. The pattern is you, your face, your voice, your memories, your personality, the way you laugh, the things you fear. All of it is information encoded in the arrangement of roughly 7 octillion atoms. That is a 7 followed by 27 zeros, held together by chemical bonds and electromagnetic forces. When you die, the pattern dissolves, but the atoms do not. Not a single one of them disappears. They cannot. The first law forbids it. Every atom that was part of you continues to exist. It simply becomes part of something else. And here is the part that most people do not think about. Those atoms were never really yours to begin with. Every atom in your body was forged in the interior of a star. The hydrogen in the water that makes up 60% of your body was created in the first minutes after the Big Bang, roughly 13.8 billion years ago. The carbon in your muscles, the nitrogen in your DNA, the calcium in your bones, the iron in your blood, all of these heavier elements were produced in the nuclear furnaces of massive stars. Stars that burned for millions of years and then exploded in supernovae, scattering their elemental remains across the galaxy. Those remains coalesced into new stars, new planets, and eventually into the thin film of biology that covers the surface of this particular rock, orbiting this particular star. You are not metaphorically made of stardust. You are literally constructed from the debris of exploding stars. The calcium in your right hand may have come from a different supernova than the calcium in your left. The atoms in your body are older than the Earth itself. They were old when the dinosaurs walked. They were old when the first single-celled organism divided in a warm pool 3.8 billion years ago. And they will be here long after you are gone. When you die, whether your body is buried, cremated, or composted, those atoms re-enter the cycle. In burial, decomposition breaks down the complex molecules of your body into simpler compounds. Carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere. Nitrogen and phosphorus seep into the soil. Water evaporates or percolates into the groundwater. Within a year, the atoms that were once you are incorporated into the soil, into plants, into insects, into the bodies of other organisms. A tree growing above a grave is, in a very real chemical sense, built in part from the person buried beneath it. In cremation, the process is faster. The intense heat breaks molecular bonds and converts organic matter into carbon dioxide, water vapor, and mineral ash. The gases disperse into the atmosphere. The carbon that was once part of your lungs might be absorbed by a forest 1,000 miles away. The water molecules that once carried oxygen through your bloodstream might fall as rain on a field in another country. The ash, rich in calcium phosphate, can be scattered or buried, returning minerals to the earth. A single human body contains enough carbon to make 900 pencils, enough phosphorus to make 2,200 match heads, enough iron to make a small nail, enough potassium to fire a toy cannon, enough sulfur to rid a dog of fleas. These numbers are whimsical, but the underlying truth is not. You are a temporary arrangement of common elements, and when the arrangement ends, the elements continue. Research at forensic anthropology facilities has documented this in detail. A decomposing body creates what scientists call a cadaver decomposition island. The soil beneath and around the body becomes dramatically enriched with nutrients. Nitrogen levels spike. Microbial diversity explodes. Plant growth in the immediate area becomes visibly more vigorous, sometimes for years after the body is gone. Your death does not just feed new life. It creates an island of fertility, a burst of ecological energy that radiates outward from the point where you return to the earth. The green burial movement embraces this reality. Instead of embalming the body with formaldehyde, a toxic preservative designed to delay decomposition and sealing it in a metal casket inside a concrete vault, green burial allows the body to decompose naturally. The body is wrapped in a simple shroud or placed in a biodegradable container and buried in shallow soil. No chemicals, no concrete, no barriers between the body and the earth. The decomposition is rapid, complete, and ecologically productive. Human composting, which has been legalized in a growing number of jurisdictions, takes this further. The body is placed in a vessel with organic materials such as wood chips, alfalfa, and straw. Over a period of roughly 30 to 60 days, thermophilic bacteria break down the body at elevated temperatures, producing nutrient-rich soil. The soil can be used to grow gardens, restore forests, or nourish landscapes. You become, quite literally, the ground from which new life grows. In a purely materialist framework, this is the afterlife. Not a place you go, a process you become. The redistribution of your matter and energy into the ongoing story of life on Earth. The carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the water cycle. These are not abstractions. They are the mechanisms by which your atoms will travel through the biosphere for millions of years after you are gone. But there is a loss here that the physics cannot address, and it is the loss that most people actually grieve. It is not the atoms, nobody mourns the carbon. What people mourn is the pattern, the specific arrangement of matter and energy that was you, your personality, your memories, your sense of humor, the sound of your voice, the way you looked when you were thinking. The information theory tells us that the information encoded in your brain, the roughly 86 billion neurons, connected by approximately 100 trillion synaptic connections, that stored your entire life, your memories, your skills, your identity, appears to be destroyed at death. The neural networks degrade, the synapses dissolve, the electrical patterns cease, the specific configuration that was you is lost. This is the hardest thing for many people to accept. Not that the body dies. We can understand that. The body is obviously temporary. What is harder is the idea that the pattern, the you of you, dissolves irreversibly. However, quantum mechanics offers a curious footnote. The no-hiding theorem, a principle in quantum information theory, states that quantum information cannot be completely destroyed. It can be scrambled. It can be dispersed. It can be transformed beyond any practical possibility of recovery, but it cannot be annihilated. The information is always somewhere. This principle underlies one of the great debates in theoretical physics, the black hole information paradox, which asks whether information that falls into a black hole is truly lost or is somehow preserved. The current consensus, following decades of work by Stephen Hawking and others, is that information is conserved. Whether this abstract conservation of quantum information has any relevance to personal consciousness is unknown. The gap between the preservation of quantum information in the mathematical sense and the survival of your subjective experience as a person is vast. But it is worth noting that even at the most fundamental level of physics, the universe appears to be reluctant to lose information entirely. Here is what we can say with certainty. You have already died and been reborn countless times. The atoms in your body are replaced continuously. Your cells divide and are replaced. Your skin is entirely new every 2 to 3 weeks. Your red blood cells are replaced every 4 months. Your skeleton is fully remodeled every 10 years. The you who exists right now is not materially the same. you who existed 7 years ago. Almost every atom has been swapped out, and yet you persist. Your sense of continuity, your feeling of being the same person you were yesterday and last year and a decade ago, survives the complete replacement of your physical substance. Whatever makes you you, it is not the atoms themselves, it is the pattern, the organization, the information. And the question of whether that pattern can survive the ultimate replacement, the replacement of the entire body at once, the event we call death, is the question that sits at the heart of every chapter we have explored tonight. We have one chapter left, and in it, we are going to try to bring all of this together. The science, the mythology, the philosophy, the quantum mechanics, the neurology, the ancient wisdom, and the modern uncertainty. We are going to stand at the edge of everything we know and everything we do not know, and we are going to ask the only question that matters. Chapter 14. The question that will never be answered. So here we are, at the end, or perhaps at the beginning of something we cannot yet name. We have traveled a long way tonight, from the EEG of an 87-year-old man in Estonia to the gamma surges in 4 dying brains in Michigan, from the operating rooms where cardiac arrest survivors described things they should not have been able to see, to the laboratories where rats' brains flooded with dimethyltryptamine as their hearts stopped beating, from the bedsides of Alzheimer patients who woke up one last time, to the Hall of Mart where Anubis weighed the heart against a feather, from the Bardos of Tibet to the Great Hall of Valhalla, from the River Styx to the Bridge of Asarat, from the hard problem of consciousness to the quantum vibrations inside microtubules, from a biologist who says death is an illusion to the simple, undeniable fact that every atom in your body will one day belong to something else. Now let us lay out what we actually know. We know that the brain is extraordinarily active during the process of dying. Gamma wave surges, concentrated in the regions most associated with consciousness and perception, have been documented in multiple studies. The dying brain does not shut down, it lights up. We know that some people who have been clinically dead and then resuscitated report structured, vivid experiences. Some of these experiences include verified perceptions of events that occurred while the person had no heartbeat and minimal to no measurable brain activity. The AWARE studies, the largest scientific investigations of death ever conducted, have documented these accounts under controlled conditions. We know that dimethyltryptamine is produced endogenously in the mammalian brain, that it is present at concentrations comparable to major neurotransmitters like serotonin, that its levels spike during cardiac arrest, and that exogenous DMT produces experiences structurally identical to near-death experiences. Whether the brain produces enough DMT at the moment of death to generate a full psychedelic experience in humans remains an open question. We know that terminal lucidity occurs, that people with brains destroyed by decades of neurodegenerative disease can suddenly regain cognitive function shortly before death, that this phenomenon has been documented by researchers, witnessed by thousands of healthcare professionals, and is now being studied prospectively with EEG monitoring by the National Institutes of Health. We know that virtually every civilization in human history has described an afterlife with strikingly consistent structural features, a journey, a guide, a moral evaluation, multiple possible destinations. These patterns appear independently across cultures that had no contact with one another. We know that consciousness remains the deepest unsolved problem in science, that no theory explains how subjective experience arises from physical processes, that the materialist assumption, while supported by extensive correlation, has not produced a mechanistic explanation for the existence of inner life. We know that quantum theories of consciousness, while controversial, are generating testable predictions and accumulating experimental support, that microtubules appear to play a role in consciousness beyond their structural function, that quantum effects have been demonstrated in biological systems at room temperature, and that the quantum information in a system cannot, according to the laws of physics, be completely destroyed. And we know that every atom in your body was forged in a star, that those atoms will be recycled into new forms of life after your death, and that the first law of thermodynamics guarantees that the energy that is you will continue to exist in some form forever. Now, here is what we do not know. We do not know whether consciousness can exist independently of a functioning brain. We do not know whether near-death experiences represent actual perception of something beyond the physical world or sophisticated neural artifacts generated by a brain in extremis. We do not know whether the self, the specific pattern that is you, your memories, your personality, your identity, can survive in any form beyond biological death, and we do not know the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. These are not minor gaps. These are the gaps that matter most, and they are the gaps that every religion, every mythology, every philosophy, and every scientific theory we have discussed tonight is trying to fill. But there is something remarkable in the convergence. Across all the material we have covered, certain themes keep recurring regardless of the framework. A moral evaluation, the near-death life review, the Egyptian weighing of the heart, the Islamic mizan, the Buddhist karmic reckoning, the Greek judges of the underworld. In framework after framework, tradition after tradition, the moment of death involves an accounting of how you lived, a transition, not an instant termination. The brain does not flip off like a switch. Death is a process that unfolds over minutes, possibly hours. Every tradition we have examined describes stages. The dissolution of the elements in the bardo, the journey through the duat, the crossing of the river, the passage through the tunnel. Death is not a wall, it is a corridor. The dissolution of self followed by something else. Whether it is the clear light of the bardo, the tunnel of the near-death experience, or the quantum dissipation of Ork-Or, something follows the end of the individual self, the ego dissolves. And then, according to nearly every account, something opens. And the importance of how you lived. Karma, the weighing of the heart, the life review, the judgment of souls. Across traditions separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, the message is the same. What you did matters, not just in this life, at the threshold of whatever comes next. These convergences might mean that all cultures are encoding the same neurological event in different symbolic languages. The gamma surge, the DMT release, the disinhibition of the dying brain may produce a universal experience that humans have been dressing in cultural clothing for as long as we have been human. The life review is a hippocampal discharge. The tunnel is the visual cortex collapsing. The beings of light are projections of the temporal lobe. And every mythology in history is an elaborate interpretation of the same 30 seconds of brain activity. Or they might mean something more. Dr. Sam Parnia, after decades of research into the dying process, wrote that research to date has neither proved nor disproved the reality or meaning of patients' experiences and claims of awareness in relation to death. He is being careful. He is being scientific. He is saying what the data allows him to say and nothing more. And that restraint, that willingness to say, we do not know, may be the most important thing anyone has said in this entire documentary. Because the question of what happens after we die is the one question that every human being will eventually answer for themselves. And no one has ever come back with a definitive report. The near-death survivors come close, but they did not complete the journey. They were pulled back. They returned to their bodies, to their lives, to a world that does not know what lies on the other side of the door they briefly opened. Science is inching closer to understanding the dying process, but consciousness remains the deepest mystery in the universe. Every religion offers certainty, but certainty is not the same as knowledge. Every philosophy offers frameworks, but frameworks are not the same as answers. And maybe that not knowing is the most important thing about being human, because it forces us to decide not what is true, because we cannot know that, but what we believe, how we want to live, and what we think matters. If death is annihilation, if the materialist view is correct, and there is nothing beyond the final firing of the last neuron, then this life, this moment, this breath is all there is, and it is therefore infinitely precious. Every conversation, every kindness, every sunset, every hand held in the dark is a universe of meaning, in a cosmos of silence. If this is all there is, then the fact that it exists at all is the most extraordinary thing that has ever happened. And if death is a door, if consciousness survives in some form, if the soul or the quantum information or the pattern that is you continues beyond the body, then the way you lived matters in ways that extend beyond this lifetime. The life review is coming. The weighing of the heart is real. The karma accumulates. And what you carry with you into whatever comes next is not your wealth or your status or your possessions. It is the weight of your actions, the kindness you showed, the love you gave, the harm you caused, the truth you told. Either way, the conclusion is the same. This life matters. How you live it matters. What you do with your time here, however brief it is against the backdrop of eternity, matters. Whether death is a door, a wall, or a mirror, whether it leads to the field of reeds, the bardo, Valhalla, quantum dissipation, or simply nothing. The fact that your consciousness exists at all right now, hearing these words, thinking these thoughts, wondering about your own mortality, is the single most improbable and unexplained event in the known universe. Every atom in your body was forged in a dying star. Every molecule in your brain is part of a chain of chemistry that stretches back to the origin of life on this planet. Every breath you take connects you to every organism that has ever breathed. You are not separate from the universe. You are the universe temporarily organized into a person, temporarily aware of itself, temporarily asking the question, whatever comes next, you were here, you existed, you wondered, and that, by any standard, scientific, spiritual, or mythological, is extraordinary.